Number 3. This happened yesterday. Sorry if there are any grammar mistakes. I'm writing this from my phone, so there might be some. My cousin asked me to babysit her children while her husband and her went to work. I didn't mind since I was off, and I love spending time with them. I live across the street from a neighborhood park, and if you live in the city, you know the park is extremely populated due to the summer camps they offer. Well, as soon as I walked out the door from my house, my niece noticed my friend, Sophie, was parking her car. She usually comes over on my days off, since we hardly hang out because we both have very busy schedules. I told her I was headed to the park since the weather was nice and the kids can play outside, so she tagged along. We didn't realize how hot it was until we were there for about an hour or so. I thought it was time for us to go. We were making our way to the water fountain when I looked up and noticed a man holding his camera. He looked about 60 years old, and like your typical tourist. He had a sun hat, a map tucked in his pocket, a backpack, and a camera case. The guy was busy taking pictures of a couple of kids from the summer camp program. I know from working in events and photography that if you're trying to take pictures of children, you have to have the consent of their guardians because you don't want to look like a creeper. The camp counselors noticed the guy as well, and were talking amongst themselves to see who was going to go talk to the guy. None of them did. Since the guy figured out that he was being watched, he gathered his things quickly and tried to walk away. I knew it was wrong, and I told my friend to watch my niece and nephew. I walked up to the guy, and I informed him that he wasn't supposed to be taking pictures of children without their parents' consent. He said he wasn't taking pictures of anything but the scenery. I called out his bullshit, and I asked him to show me the pictures. He became extremely nervous and said no. He left me no choice but to call the police. As I said before, due to it being summer, the parks were populated, and there were a lot of foot and car patrols. It took less than a minute for the nearest officer to come. I told him the situation, and he asked the guy to delete the pictures. The guy started to argue with the officer, but he couldn't win since the camp counselors didn't give consent. The guy finally willingly gave the officer his camera and reviewed the pictures. This guy was taking pictures of the kids, but he zoomed into their faces and their private areas. The officer kept going through the pictures and discovered older pictures of children like this, but close up. He was arrested, and they took statements from me and the counselors. It made me sick to my stomach to know that happened while I was there with my 6-year-old niece and 1-year-old nephew. I hope he gets what he deserves. Number 2. This is short, but still a very startling story to me. My dad was out for a job interview, so me and my sister had the place to ourselves for about 2 hours. I watched TV downstairs and went outside, and when I came back in, I left the door unlocked for my dad, since it was getting close to the time he said he'd be home. I went upstairs and hung out with my sister for a while. I heard the front door open and rummaging through cabinets as well. I just assumed that it was my dad since he always likes to check everything is in place before relaxing. I also heard my dad's door open and close, albeit slowly, a few times. I was talking with my sister when the phone rang. To my surprise, it was my dad on the other end. He told me that he was going to be getting home late and that we needed to make our own dinners. It felt like my heart fell to my feet as he said that. I realized that it wasn't my dad that had entered the house. I hurriedly rushed downstairs to see if everything was okay. Several things were gone, and the front door was wide open. I then heard what sounded like breathing coming from the downstairs bathroom. I choked the urge to yell as I saw a hand wrap around the door and a face peer around the corner. As soon as the guy saw me, he ran like hell out of there. I chased after him, but he was long gone. On the floor in the bathroom, I later found, of all things, a box cutter knife. I'm not sure what his intentions were with the weapon, but they weren't good, if anything. I called the police soon after, but they could never find him. Now, my dad always calls when he's heading home to make sure I know he's still gone. Number 1. This incident happened last year to me on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone, since our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed my brother and I out, because we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating, and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over because they still wanted to go out trick-or-treating. So that left me home alone with my brother handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 o'clock, almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch, watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who the hell could be knocking on our door this late. I assumed that it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters, but even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy, or that we weren't home. So I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole, and I saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with a hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face I could see was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way that this guy was a trick-or-treater, because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was gonna open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you in there alone?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pocket, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get the fuck away from my house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in, probably because he knew I wasn't fucking around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely off of our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. We were a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man, since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now, when I think back to this, I wish we had called the police, because maybe we would have been able to prevent a murder. The next day, we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from the information we had given them, since we hadn't seen many details on his face. They went on the hunt for the man but never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all is the fact that he didn't take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched. He could have gone in and taken what he wanted since her door was wide open. This means that he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He only had the urge to murder.